Luke and here, if I can get you guys to get these out later, about mid class. Okay, we're picking up in Isaiah 38. And we should get through 38 and 39 with some, 36 and 37. We're in 36. We talked about 38 and 39 last week. 36 and 37 we're dealing with this week because 38 and 39 actually come before them chronologically. So we're picking up in 36. We should get through 36 and 37 relatively quickly. And then we'll start a new section of the book, which is ultimately the last major section, 40 through 66. We're in 36:1. It says, "It came to pass in the 14th year of King Hezekiah that Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the defenced cities of Judah and took them." If you make notes in your Bible, you can confidently place the time frame to be 701 BC. Now, the difficulty that comes in then is how we ought to mess with the years of Hezekiah's reign. It's clear to me that Isaiah 36:1 is the year 701 BC. But if this is the 14th year of Hezekiah, it would seem that Hezekiah started his rule in 715. The difference with that is this. In these times, they had a lot of what was called co-regencies. And so because of that, which means that he ruled alongside his father, it could be in other cases, in other contexts, that Hezekiah's reign should be said to start at about 727 or even 728 or 729. So, for the moment, it seems clear that we're talking about when he took the throne exclusively. He's not reigning any longer with his father, Ahaz. He is ruling by himself starting in 715. The 14th year then being 701. In 701, there's archaeological evidence, secular evidence all over the place, demonstrating that Sennacherib, king of Assyria, moved south into the land after having taken 46 cities, 200,000 captives. He now moves against the city Jerusalem. And so if we look at our map, here's the Mediterranean Sea. The continent of Africa is down here. And so over to the right of the Mediterranean Sea, you have the city of Jerusalem. Sennacherib and the Assyrians are to the north. And they have now moved in. And in this conquest, they have taken 46 cities, 200,000 captives. And now they surround the city of Jerusalem. And that's what we're picking up on this evening. This is going to be the end of the first section of Isaiah, 1 through 39. This is how the text comes to a climax, comes to a close. In 36:1, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the defenced cities of Judah and took them. And so the king of Assyria sent Rabshakeh. Now Rabshakeh, it looks like it's a name in our English text. It is a title or an office, like the word president or king. It's the Rabshakeh. We don't have his name. And the King James especially seems to suggest that it's his name. It's a title, rather though. From Lachish to Jerusalem unto King Hezekiah. So this officer shows up with a great army. And he stood by the conduit of the upper pool in the highway of the fuller's field. This is a place in Jerusalem. We've seen it before in chapter 7. This is where Isaiah comes and prophesies to Ahaz about the coming child, Emmanuel. And so in 36 and verse 3, then came forth unto him Eliakim. And we've talked about him before in Isaiah 22. Hilkiah's son, who is now over the house. Back in 22, he had not yet been. Shebna was over the house. There's been a switch. Now, just according to as Isaiah said in 22, Eliakim's going to be the one over the house. And Shebna now has been demoted. And that's what it says in 36:3. And Joah, Asaph's son, the recorder. So the three come and they meet this man, the Rabshakeh, at the conduit, the upper conduit of the fuller's field. Here they gather. What's going to take place? What you have are two different groups. One group is from the Assyrian camp, and they come and they meet. And the other group is from Hezekiah's camp, the Israeli camp. And they come and they meet. So they're going to have a discussion. Well, it says in 36:4, the Rabshakeh said unto them, Say ye now to Hezekiah, Here's the Assyrian message. Here it is. Thus saith the great king. He bombed there. No, the great king's not talking yet. This is Sennacherib. This is the Assyrian king. This is the one who rules the earth in his day, so he thinks. But the great king is gone. He's missed. And so it says in 36:4, the king of Assyria says, what confidence is this wherein you trust? Why do you put stock in God? Do you really think that you're going to escape Assyria? Look at the map. Look at this. You've got cities all over the place. What happened to Damascus? Oh, what happened to Samaria? What happened to the 46 cities scattered all around the land? There are no more. You could look from the upper walls of the city of Jerusalem and all you would see is a wilderness, a plain. And it's on fire. The smoke's coming up. And everything about the invasion of Sennacherib says, you will not succeed. And so the king of Assyria sends his embassy, and they're even boasting of it. You won't succeed. So why are you trusting in yourselves? Why are you trusting in God? Why are you trusting in anybody? Thinking that you're going to be delivered. And so the text says in verse 5, I say, sayest thou, but they are but vain words. I have counsel and strength for war. And so the Rabshakeh asked, now on whom do you trust that you actually rebel against me? He's speaking for the king, of course. Rabshakeh is. And so Sennacherib's boasting. He's saying, who are you trusting in that you're actually going to find deliverance? And in verse 6, lo, you trust in the staff of this broken reed on Egypt. Maybe Egypt will be the nation that will come and rescue them right when it looks like it's too late. And he says, whereupon if a man even leans on Egypt, this broken reed, instead of actually finding support, it'll be like the reed that's been broken off at the tip, runs him through and comes out the hand. There's no support there. It's too sharp. Egypt's not going to be something on which we can rely. And so he says in verse 6, it will actually pierce it. That's how Pharaoh, king of Egypt, will be to all that trust in him. Don't turn to Egypt. The Assyrians are boasting. Do you think we've not thought of this? Do you not think that we've thought maybe they'll go south and try to find aid in Egypt? No, they've thought that through. And so it says in verse 7, but if you say to me, we trust in the Lord our God. Oh, there's the final resort. The last resort might be to say, well, Egypt is going to fail us. We're not going to have any real success, but maybe God will save us. Well, look at this. It says, is it not He? Isn't the God you serve the same God that's over these 46 cities that I've taken? Why did He allow a single city to fall? Even more so, 46. Why would He allow this to happen? If that's the God you serve, why has He allowed so much calamity to take place? That's what Assyria is boasting. And so they say in verse 7, He, the one you're claiming now that maybe He'll deliver you, He's the one whose high places and altars Hezekiah the king has taken away, and he said to Judah and to Jerusalem, you will worship before this altar? Okay, what's going on? We've got to explain some of that. From the Assyrian point of view, here you are a foreigner. You are not an Israelite. You're looking in at the nation, and you look out to the mountaintops, and there they've got this altar built, and they're throwing pigs, children in some cases, and whatever sacrifices upon these altars, but they're offering these things, or even people, sadly, before idols. To the Assyrian people, it looks like you're just another one of the cults of the day. And so when Hezekiah the king comes along and starts forbidding that these altars be set up, to Assyria, it looks like Hezekiah is actually against the nation, doesn't it? See, from Assyria's point of view, it looks like Hezekiah is against his own people. He's tearing down their religious altars. He's making sure they don't worship anymore. What Assyria doesn't realize is these things were never authorized by God in the first place. These are idolatrous practices. And so it says this in 36, in verse 8, now therefore give pledges, I pray thee, to my master the king of Assyria, and I'll give you 2,000 horses, if you are even able on your part to set riders upon them. What he's saying is we've got 185,000 troops that are now circling your city. That's what the text says later on. We'll see exactly how large their army was. And Sennacherib knows that within the city of Jerusalem, it's questionable whether or not they can even provide 2,000 men to sit upon horses. And so Sennacherib, the Assyrians, boast, even if we were to spot you 2,000 horses, it wouldn't even faze us. We're surrounding your city. Success is not going to be had. Destruction is imminent. And so it says in 37 and verse 9, how then are you going to turn away the face of one captain of the least of my master's servants and put your trust on Egypt for chariots and for horsemen? And am I now come up without the Lord against this land to destroy it? The Lord said unto me, go up against this land and destroy it. Do you really think Rabshakeh knew that? I don't. Not at all. Here's what I think. Rabshakeh and all of the other Assyrians have had spies. They've had people throughout the land. In fact, they've already covered the 46 cities surrounding Jerusalem. They've heard the chatter. They know what people are saying. We're the nation in whom God resides. We're the nation that God has selected. Rabshakeh doesn't believe that God has grabbed a hold of Assyria and led him against his own people any more than any of the other heathens believed it. But Rabshakeh knows the reports that are going around. Rabshakeh knows what's being said. Oh, if this is really God's land, this is really God's nation, well, even in your own theology, so he's saying, isn't it the case that God is the one directing me? How are you going to oppose me then? That's what Rabshakeh is saying. Well, in verse 11, Eliakim's going to start to respond. Now remember, Eliakim, Shebna, Joah, these are the people that are on Hezekiah's side of things. These are the people in the Jewish court. Any questions, any comments up through verse 10? Okay, take a look at verse 11. Eliakim and Shebna and Joah say unto Rabshakeh, you're speaking in the Hebrew tongue. We are educated men. Please speak, and so the text says in the King James, in the Syrian language. Your text might more properly read Aramaic. That's better. Anyway, speak in the Aramaic tongue or the Syrian tongue, for we understand it. But don't speak to us in the Jews' language. There are people that are just up on the wall and they're listening in. You keep saying things like this and our men are going to be afraid. Our morale is going to be low. Rabshakeh, he doesn't care about the morale of the Israeli people. In fact, that's probably why he's boasting in the way he is. He wants to lower their morale. And so watch what's stated in verse 12. Rabshakeh responds, my master, do you think he sent me to speak to your master and to speak these words? Don't you know that he sent me to the men that sit upon the wall? And boy, there's some really strong language at the end of verse 12. Somebody have a version that's a little more politically correct?
Who will eat and drink their own waste with you.
I half expected you to read the King James Version, Roman. Yeah, that's pretty good. Anyway, he speaks very candidly. I read one commentator who just came out and translated it with 2 swear words there, which is probably accurate. He's cursing them out, you see. He's making a real boast. This guy's not God's man. He's cussing at them. And so Rabshakeh makes this bold claim. We're going to have you eating your own bodily fluids and thing of that sort. Then he says in verse 13, Rabshakeh stood and cried with a loud voice in the Jews' language. Don't speak to us in our own tongue. He starts to speak again in their own tongue. This is intentional. And he says, hear ye the words of the great king, the king of Assyria. Thus saith the king, this is what Sennacherib is saying, don't let Hezekiah deceive you. He will not be able to deliver you. He got that one right. If you think about it, Hezekiah couldn't deliver the people. No matter how hard Hezekiah would try, it wouldn't be Hezekiah that would deliver these people situated in Jerusalem. who would it be? It'd be Jehovah God. See, if Hezekiah tried by his own power, his own might, he's not going to succeed. We're going to find out what causes success here in a moment. And so he says in verse 15, well, don't even let Hezekiah make you trust in the Lord. He's wrong there. And he says, saying, well, the Lord will surely deliver us. This city shall not be delivered into the hand of the king of Assyria. And so this guy, Rabshakeh, says, don't listen to Hezekiah, verse 16. And here's what the king of Assyria says. Make an agreement or a pact or a covenant with me by a present. Send me a gift. And come out to me, and eat ye every one of his vine, every one of his fig tree, drink ye of every one of the waters of his own cistern, until I come and take you away to a land like your own land, a land of corn and wine, a land of bread and vineyards. He says, you send a gift, I'll let you escape. We'll actually bring you back to Assyria in an honorable way, and you'll have plenty there. Doesn't that sound so nice and fanciful? And you can imagine the Jews saying, all of this sounds lovely. Yeah. The problem with this is Assyria has already broken their word about this sort of thing before. We don't have time to read it. But if you were to read 2 Kings 18, the text says that Hezekiah had already sent a gift once before so that they wouldn't even invade the land. And guess what they did? They invaded the land. What do you think is going to happen if Hezekiah now sends out this tribute? They're going to still invade. They're not honest. They're not working for God. They're not working for anything but their own selfish desires. And so the Assyrians are not to be trusted. But in verse 18, he continues his speech, Rabshakeh does, and says, beware lest Hezekiah persuade you, saying, the Lord will deliver us. Hath any of the gods of the nations delivered his land out of the hand of the king of Assyria? We've taken all of these cities. We've taken all of these nations, all of these lands. Not a single god has stopped us yet. In fact, just the other day, we marched in and destroyed that god named Marduk. Just the other day, Dagon, where's he now? You hear about Dagon after 1 Samuel 5? Not really. And what about those other gods that were scattered throughout the Canaanite land? What about Ashtaroth? What about Molech? What about Chemosh? You don't hear a whole lot about them anymore, do you? See, Assyria actually did something really good for us even. I know this was like 2,700 years ago, but they did something extremely good for us. They decimated the idols. And what Assyria did, so says George Adam Smith, is they reduced the land to monotheism. Do you see how that sets up something for us? I mean, you hear something about Babylon, and Babylon offers us a lot before Rome comes. We hear things said about Rome. Rome offered roads so that the gospel could go out in the first century. You heard that said before? Or when Rome built the roads, you hear that sort of thing. Well, that's the same thing Assyria actually offers to the land. They're not doing it because they want to serve God, but they do it just because of the fallout. They start destroying all of these other places around Jerusalem, and what they've done is they've reduced the land to monotheism. There's only one God left. And so when it looks like, well, we can rattle off and list them all, of all of those gods that Assyria has destroyed, there's only one that remains at this point, and surely we're going to destroy him too. That one named Yahweh, Jehovah, give us a few days and Jerusalem's going to be destroyed and he won't be any longer either. And then something happens with Hezekiah. The Lord God Jehovah manifests exactly who he is. He's going to teach Assyria a lesson that out of all of those millions of gods that Assyria had destroyed, there's one that's legitimate. There's one that's real. One in whom we ought to put our trust. And that's what Assyria is going to find out. Take a look at verse 19. Where are the gods of Hamath, Arphad, the gods of Sepharvaim? Have they delivered Samaria out of my hand? You don't hear about those guys anymore. Who are they among all the gods of these lands that have delivered their land out of my hand? That the Lord should deliver Jerusalem out of my hand. He's just another one of the gods. And it says in verse 21, they held their peace. They answered him not a word. It was the king Hezekiah's commandment, saying, answer him not. Don't even respond. And in verse 22, then came Eliakim that was over the household, Shebna the scribe, Joah. And they came and they told it to Hezekiah with their clothes rent. And they told him the words of Rabshakeh. What do you do? What do I do? When somebody comes and bears the horrible, horrific news. What do? I've never been in this situation. You've never been in a situation where you're camped inside the city and you've got the armies outside your door and you're witnessing near imminent destruction. It's not going to happen like that for us exactly, but these things happen again. They happen in our lives. We're going to talk a little bit later as we move into chapter 40 this evening about how Isaiah's text presents to us something far more. I'm jumping ahead. But when Paul says what he says in Romans 15:4 about whatsoever things were written aforetime were written for our learning, that we, through patience and comfort of the Scriptures, might have hope, he has a whole lot more in mind than just telling us there's a lot of good stories in the Old Testament that we need to realize and be familiar with and learn good moral truths from. There's a lot more than that there. What Paul is telling us is that history repeats itself. It may not be Assyria that's moving in on you. Maybe it's the illness. Maybe it's death. Maybe it's the loss of a loved one. Maybe it's the situation with your own relatives and how you can't get along. What do you do in these situations? Thankfully, Hezekiah is a righteous man at this point in his life, and he gives us a good example to follow. He's going to tell us exactly what we ought to do. Take a look at 37:1. It came to pass when King Hezekiah heard it. He hears the bad news. He could say, well, let's get as many swords and shields together as we've got in the city. Bring forth those people who work witchcraft. We could trust in that. And if we were to really make some modern application, this may be really far stretched, but I think it fits. He doesn't start popping the pills, you see. I mean, some people have started trusting in all sorts of drugs, alcohol, cigarettes. They're not trusting in this sort of thing. Their hold is God. And that's what it ought to be in our lives as well. It says this in 37:1. When King Hezekiah heard it, he rent his clothes. He covered himself with sackcloth. And he did what we ought to do. He went into the house of the Lord. If you're looking for deliverance in somebody else, something else, you're not going to find it. Some people trust in riches. Some people trust in their homes. Some people trust in their children. Some people trust in whatever. Just this week, the Patriots lost. You see what I'm saying? I mean, even the people you count on to be successful fail. But there's somebody who never does. And it's Jehovah God. And that's what King Hezekiah is getting at. Look at 37:2. He sent Eliakim, same guys he had just received the word from, and Shebna, and the elders of the priests covered with sackcloth. He sent them unto Isaiah the prophet. Go figure. All of a sudden, we're in a life or death situation. They call for the preacher. What happens? Look at 37:3. They said unto him, Thus saith Hezekiah, this day is a day of trouble and of rebuke and of blasphemy. For the children are come to the birth, and there is not strength to bring forth. It may be that the Lord thy God will hear the words of Rabshakeh, whom the king of Assyria his master hath sent to reproach the living God, and will reprove the words which the Lord thy God hath heard. And so Hezekiah says unto Isaiah, Lift up your prayer for the remnant that is left. 200,000 are gone, died, captives, wherever they are. And there's only a small portion, so much so that there's even a question about whether or not they could even put 2,000 men on horses if they were spotted then by Assyria. And so the text says, pray for the small group that still lives in Zion, Jerusalem. And so watch what happens, verse 5. The servants of King Hezekiah came to Isaiah, and Isaiah said unto them, Thus shall ye say unto your master, This is what the Lord says. Thus saith the Lord, Don't be afraid of the words that thou hast heard, wherewith the servants of the king of Assyria have blasphemed me. Behold, I'll send a blast upon him, and he'll hear a rumor, and return to his own land. And I'll cause him to fall by the sword in his own land. Basically, Isaiah is saying, you trust in God, it's all going to turn out okay. We're going to defeat these Assyrians who are camped around the city. And in verse 8, Rabshakeh returned, found the king of Assyria warring against Libnah. Difficult to say exactly what all is happening here historically. I don't think it's significant for our interpretation of the text. But take a look then at verse 8. For he had heard that he was departed from Lachish. Maybe it's the case that Libnah had been giving him a bit of trouble. And so King Sennacherib is a little bit away from the city. Or maybe it's the case that he's still surrounding the city of Jerusalem and has to leave and come back. I don't know. I really don't. And I've read the scholars. They can't agree on the matter either. So we'll leave it alone. But in verse 9, he heard say concerning Tirhakah, king of Ethiopia, he has come forth to make war with thee. And when he heard it, he sent messengers to Hezekiah, saying, Thus shall ye speak to Hezekiah, king of Judah, saying, Let not thy God, in whom thou trustest, deceive thee, saying, Jerusalem shall not be given into the hand of the king of Assyria. Rabshakeh once again is saying, don't think that you're going to escape. God can't deliver you. And so in verse 11, Behold, thou hast heard what the kings of Assyria have done to all lands by destroying them utterly. And you think you're going to be delivered? Does that make sense? Well, in verse 12, Have the gods of the nations delivered them which my fathers have destroyed, Gozan, Haran, Rezeph, the children of Eden which were in Telassar? He lists off some of these places as evidence. We've destroyed just about everybody, you see. That's what he's saying. Verse 13, the king of Hamath, the king of Arphad, the king of Sepharvaim, Hena, Iva. Verse 14, Hezekiah, here's what he does. He receives the letter from the hand of the messengers, and he read it. And so once again it says he takes it and spreads it before the Lord in the house of the Lord. And in verse 15, Hezekiah now, not Isaiah, but Hezekiah prays. And he says in 16, O Lord of hosts, God of Israel, yes, the one that dwells between the cherubims upon the ark of the covenant, you are God, even you alone. And he makes this prayer. Incline your ear, verse 17. Open your eyes, hear, see, hear the words of Sennacherib. He's reproaching you. That's what he says in 17. He's reproaching you, the living and active God. What if Hezekiah had requested God, spare me? Think about me. Think about what I'm going to lose. I'm sure the outcome would have been different. It's because he's concerned with God and God's identity and how God looks to the nations. He says, they're reproaching you, God. And it's because he's concerned for God, not himself, that success is going to happen. And so verse 18, Of a truth, Lord, the kings of Assyria, they've laid waste all the nations, their countries. They've cast their gods into the fire. They don't even believe in gods, but the work of men's hands, wood and stone, they've destroyed those things. Now save therefore, O Lord, verse 20, save us from his hand, that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you are the Lord, even you only. And then in verse 21, Isaiah comes back into the scene. And it says in 37:21, Isaiah the son of Amoz sent unto Hezekiah, saying, Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, Whereas thou hast prayed to me against Sennacherib king of Assyria, here is the word which the Lord has now spoken concerning him. The virgin, the daughter of Zion, hath despised thee and laughed thee to scorn. The daughter of Jerusalem hath shaken her head at thee. Whom hast thou reproached and blasphemed? And against whom have you exalted your voice and lifted up your eyes on high? It was against the Holy One of Israel. Why did Assyria even take the 46 cities? Why did they ever even start with one? It was because these people here had turned against God. God's own people had turned against him. And to teach them and refine their faith and to let them know exactly who God was and how they ought to recognize him, he brought these people to the fire. And so it says in 37, look at this, in verse 24, By your servants have you reproached the Lord, and said, By the multitude of my chariots am I come up to the height of the mountains, to the sides of Lebanon. All of this is a very contextual way of their saying, everything that we've achieved, it's been by our own might, it's been by our own hand. God didn't do this for us, we did it. That's the point they're making. And God is now saying through Isaiah, shame on you. Shame on the people. And so in verse 24, they said they would enter into the height of his border, the forest of his Carmel, Mount Carmel, of course. Verse 25, I've digged and drunk water with the sole of my feet, have I dried up all the rivers of the besieged places. Have you not heard long ago how I've done it, and of ancient times that I have formed it? That's what God's saying. God is now speaking through Isaiah, reminding them, you didn't do any of this. I did it, God says. I'm responsible. And here you are arrogantly making the claim like you've done it all for yourselves. It was when they were little, it was when they were the fewest that God brought them out of Egypt. And if they can't remember the miraculous works he worked back then, why, they just don't know their own history. But God tells them, it was I that was with you. I did all of this. And they've forgotten these things. Shame on us. Shame on us when we forget our own history and don't learn from the mistakes we've made. That's what problems, those were the problems that arose in Israel. They'd forgotten God and what He had done. And because they had forgotten all of that, they start suffering for it. And so in verse 27, their inhabitants were of small power, dismayed, confounded. They were as the grass of the field, the green herb, as the grass on the housetops, and as corn blasted before it be grown up. But in verse 28, God says, I know your abode, you're going out, you're coming in. I have knowledge of these things. You're dealing with an all-knowing God, He says. And so He says in verse 29, because thy rage against me, the people hated God. Because they hated God. He says in 29, therefore I will put my hook in thy nose, and my bridle in thy lips, and I will turn thee back by the way which thou camest. If anybody who's wicked, God opposes them, He's saying. He's not partial. Well, just because you're a physical Israelite, you're just going to be overlooked. Well, because you're Assyrian, I'm using you now to punish Israel. You're going to be overlooked. God's bringing a judgment out on the wicked. And it's through this medium that's taking place in Isaiah's day. Well, take a look at this. Verse 30. This shall be a sign unto thee. Here's what's going to happen. This year, you're going to eat the things that grow of themselves. So the crops. You're going to eat the crops. But then He says in verse 30, and the second year, that which springs of the same. You're going to eat that as well. And in the third year, you're going to sow and reap and plant vineyards and eat the fruit thereof. Basically, He's saying the land is going to be a sign, a non-miraculous sign, but it's going to stand as a symbol or an emblem that this is exactly what God's going to do to the people. And so it says in 31, and the remnant that is escaped of the house of Judah shall again take root downward and bear fruit upward. He's basically saying judgment has moved in, but within a short time, you're going to take root again, and you're going to sprout back up. Verse 32, out of Jerusalem shall go forth a remnant, they that escape out of Mount Zion, the zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. This is the faithful remnant in Isaiah's day. They're going to escape the Assyrian siege. And so it says in 33, thus saith the Lord concerning the king of Assyria, he shall not come into the city. He's not even going to shoot an arrow there. He's not going to come before it with shields, cast a bank against it. By the way that he came, he's going to return, and he will not come into this city, saith the Lord. And then here's the good message. This is the kind of preaching you want to hear. In 35, he says, I will defend this city. I'll save it for my own sake and for my servant David's sake. Okay, go to sleep now. And just take rest. Wait for God to save you. Wait for God to defend the city. What's going to happen? What are they going to see when they wake up the next morning? Are they going to see an army that comes out of Zion and goes to march for the city, for their people? No. Is Syria just going to flee? No. Somebody fill us in. What happens? What do they wake up the next morning to see?
185,000
corpses. The 185,000 sacrifices that the angel of the Lord has offered up before God. The death angel, so we're told in the text, and we have no reason to doubt that. We're told that he goes out in the midst of the night and slays the 185,000 Assyrians, wherever they may be situated around the city. And it's because of that, 36 says, the angel of the Lord went forth. He smote them. And when they arose early in the morning, they were all dead corpses. God stands true to His word. He told Hezekiah what would happen. Hezekiah didn't save the city. Verse 35 says God did. Well, it's the same with you. It's the same with me. If we seek our salvation or we seek our hope, we seek trust on our own merit, it's not going to pan out well. But we put it in God, and it'll turn out okay. Even when it looks bleak, even when things do happen that look tragic. In 37, Sennacherib, king of Assyria. Now this is interesting. Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed, went and returned and dwelt at Nineveh. That's the capital of the Assyrian land. So they're up to the north. Sennacherib goes home. And it came to pass as he was worshiping in the house of Nisroch, his god, that Adramelech and Sharezer, his own sons, smote him with the sword. And they escaped into the land of Armenia, and Esarhaddon his son reigned in his stead. Okay, this presents a strange difficulty. Somebody read Isaiah 1:1 for us.
vision of Isaiah the son of Amos, which he saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem in the days of Uzzah and all those gentlemen.
Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. So it says in 1:1, his prophetic ministry only lasts until the death of Hezekiah. Interesting that Sennacherib dies, but the year is 681. Who writes Isaiah 37, verses 37 and 38? We have a couple of possibilities. Maybe we should go the route of saying Isaiah, and so 1:1 then is not conclusive. It's not just simply saying that his prophetic ministry ends with Hezekiah, but that those are the four kings that he feels the need just to give us a chronology or a time frame in which he works. So maybe it's not only Hezekiah, but also even in the days of Hezekiah's son, Manasseh. Maybe we should say that 37, 37, and 38 were penned by Isaiah, but that it's predictive. Possible. I don't think that's the route we should take. Or the third possibility is there is another author. Somebody else comes along by inspiration and writes this kind of thing in the text by God's hand. Maybe that's the way we ought to go. I would opt for either 1 or 3. For what it's worth, I think 1 looks like the best option. I could be wrong. Any questions, any comments before we now move into another section? At this point, I'm going to have Eric and Luke, if you'll pass these out.
And you're saying that Hezekiah died at this point?
Hezekiah dies at 686. So he actually dies. And then the notation you read in 37, verses 37 and 38, historically is 5 years later. So, it's tricky. Okay, we'll start with the side titled Isaiah's text, still speaks. We'll start with the side that's titled Isaiah's text still speaks. How much time do we have incidentally? Okay. Okay, we'll start with the side Isaiah's text still speaks. Everybody should be getting one. We're almost done. If you take a look at some of these passages, and we won't read them, I put them there for your own benefit. If you look them up in your own time, that's perfectly fine. But you're going to see a case where Isaiah's text speaks of a certain event. And there is a view that states that when Isaiah says something here in the 8th century BC, there's a view that says everything that he says in what we're about to read looks forward all the way to the cross. Perhaps. Perhaps not. I want to make some other suggestions that I think are far more acceptable. Some of these texts that you're going to see, like the first one I mentioned on the handout is 40, verses 3 through 5, look exactly like this Old Testament text in Exodus 16, 7 through 10. The same kind of thing is said. Oh, when you come out of Egypt and I deliver you from the Pharaoh, you're going to see the glory of the Lord. It's going to be revealed to all flesh. When Isaiah 40, verse 5 says that same kind of thing, do we have to insist then that what Isaiah is doing is he's jumping all the way forward to the cross? I don't think so at all. In fact, I think what we see is a theme that's in view. Isaiah is setting us up with this theme, judgment and deliverance. It happened actually back into the days of Egypt, of the Pharaohs. Pharaoh had been judging God's people. They'd been oppressed. He sends Moses the deliverer. In the case of Isaiah 40 through 66, the people have been oppressed by Assyria, Babylon. We'll get to that in a moment. And now he sends forth his Redeemer, Somebody read 44:28 and 45:1. 44:28, and then the very next verse, which starts the next chapter, 45 verse 1. Okay, whoever's got it, go ahead.
That saith of Cyrus, He is my shepherd, and shall perform all my pleasure, even saying unto Jerusalem, Thou shalt be built, and to the temple thy foundation shall be laid. Thus saith the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have holden, to subdue nations before him. And I will loose the loins of kings, to open before him the two-leaved gates, and the gates shall not be shut.
Okay. In the case of the Exodus, we have an oppressor. It's Pharaoh. And then we have the deliverer, Moses. In the case of Isaiah's day, there is an oppressor. And we're going to see all of these things that they use, even the language, the terminology from the book of Exodus. And the oppressor in this case, though, is no longer the Egyptians, but now it's Assyria, Sennacherib, or in the case of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar. And so he promises a deliverer that's going to come and bring them out of exile, and names him in 44 and 45, his name is Cyrus. All of this sets up a model or a prototype. Don't be shocked then if Christ comes along 700 years after Isaiah, sees the same kinds of things happening again. But in the case of Christ, it's not Assyria or Babylon or Egypt, but it is sin. And the Redeemer, of course, is Jesus. Christ is going to use these passages to tell us about the same kind of theme. And so on the right-hand side of your paper, you've got a theme that's operative in each of these texts. Redemption, redemption, redemption. It's always about God redeeming them after they've been oppressed. And that's the same kind of theme that God's still trying to get through to us today. So I have points here that we should keep in mind. The first one being, these instances, we could duplicate these all the way through the book of Isaiah, even the Old Testament. But when the New Testament writers grab these texts, why are they grabbing them? Take a look at point number 2. The immediate context of Isaiah's situation is the captivity in Babylon, as you will easily see as we move through these later chapters. Similarly, the immediate context of the Exodus is captivity in Egypt. Nobody goes into the Egyptian text and starts talking saying, well, that's not even about Moses' day, that's about Jesus. At best, we ought to say there's a similarity there. And that's what I'm suggesting we ought to do with Isaiah's day. The point number 3 then. In order to honor the Old Testament context, we have to do that. We have to allow the Old Testament text to speak on its own merit. Instead of using the Old Testament arbitrarily and irresponsibly, we ought not to be shocked to see how Isaiah's text fits into the present scenario with Assyria, Babylon, which acts as a model then, as I suggested. I've got a note there. We're going to skip over that, read it in your own time. Point number 4. When the New Testament writers use these texts, they're not necessarily suggesting prediction is what's going on. Isaiah doesn't have to be looking immediately at Jesus Christ, but instead, Isaiah's text, like the Exodus text, teaches us generally, I have that parenthesis there, which says, though this does sometimes happen, sometimes it is just naturally predictive. But then it says, sometimes these texts teaches us of a theme, or of a larger force that's operative, how God delivers. And that's the same kind of thing that's still happening even in our own day. So as I suggested earlier then, when we read passages like Romans 15:4, which tells us to go back and read the Old Testament texts, which were written for our learning, I'm suggesting that there's much more there than just a catalog of stories that we need to just read and teach to our children. I'm suggesting that it is those same principles, those same truths, and that's what Paul's getting at in Romans 15, especially in verse 8, that you see constantly repeating themselves. When people are being judged or oppressed, he offers deliverance. And that has been the theme of the Bible ever since Genesis all the way through, even up until our modern day. I'm actually suggesting that Isaiah's text, though Old Testament and not operative legislatively, is still operative, living, active, breathing, and has lessons that even we should still take and grab and apply to our own lives. There's a lot more there. We're seeing these things happening again in our own experiences, though the names and the faces may be a little bit different. Okay. Anything on that at all? This next part is the most tricky thing, that, to my knowledge, that I've ever brought up here at Cherokee. This is going to be brutal. Man, to think that we've only got, what, like 5 minutes now? 4 minutes. 1 minute?
Well, now it's 1 minute. Well, very good.
We're going to stop here. Bring this paper back. We'll have a couple of spares if you need one, but please bring it back. This is going to be really rough, but I'm going to try to make it as understandable as possible, which is why I've given you a handout. Thank you for your attention. We'll pick up there starting in chapter 40 next.